Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are right now. We're thrilled that you're with us tonight. Welcome to our webinar. This is an important event for us as the task force of the Episcopal Diocese of New York on domestic violence and sexual assault. We have been doing this work for a decade now, and we've been doing webinars for about 6 or 7 years. And it is our hope that we can start conversations and equip people to better serve the individuals in our society who are victims of either sexual assault or domestic abuse. We couldn't do this without the support of our bishops. Andy Dici, our former diocesan bishop, started us off, and he had the experience of volunteering and supporting a shelter in Poughkeepsie, so he was very much part of that work. And from our very beginning, Matt Hyde, who is our present diocesan bishop, has been supportive of our work. I remember when he was instituted, which is the fancy Episcopalian word for becoming the rector of Heavenly Rest, that at that service, he dedicated the offering to the Violence Intervention Project, which is serving Latina victims in East Harlem. And since then has been very involved. Heavenly Rest has sponsored us for both virtual and physical trainings for clergy and laity, and as diocesan bishop has been very supportive of us. So with that shout out, I will turn the microphone over to Matt, who has a few words to say. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, mostly what I have to say is thank you. Thank you for joining this evening, but especially thank you to our Domestic Violence Task Force here in the Diocese of New York for putting this together tonight, but also in the leadership throughout the year. Grateful to their chairs, Yvonne O'Neill and Paul Feuerstein and Victoria Rollins for their work and leadership across the diocese, and to Paul for his leadership in putting together the webinar tonight. I've known Paul for a long time. He's taught me an awful lot. He has helped me to understand that 1/4 of American women are involved in domestic violence, which means this question we're talking about tonight is local to all of us in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our churches, and that domestic violence is always about power and control, which, as Paul tells me, reminds me, is the exact opposite of what the gospel of Jesus Christ means to be, which is about love and liberation. And so all of us can take steps to be part of that liberation by supporting the people around us who were involved in domestic violence. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Eloise Thomas, who I've also known for a very long time, who's been a member of the task force for the last 3 years, and will moderate this evening's webinar. Thank you for joining. Thanks to the task force. Thank you for the leadership that makes this possible.
Thank you, Bishop Hyde. I am honored to be moderating tonight's conversation surrounding domestic violence and intimate violence occurring in our communities. For those of you who are joining us tonight, please take care of yourself. Should this conversation becomes too triggering for anyone, please feel free to step away. Self-care is very important. Know that you are not alone. Available in the chat and at the end of this presentation, we are providing hotline numbers. On behalf of the Episcopal Diocese of New York Task Force on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, I welcome all of you to this very important discussion. Breaking Silence, Part 2, Exploring the Complexity of Domestic Violence at the Intersection of Race, Ethnicity, Class, and Caste. According to Merriam-Webster, the definition of intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, is the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experience of marginalized individuals or groups. Tonight, we have an esteemed group of panelists who are going to examine the ways in which race, caste, class, and ethnicity intersect to shape experience of domestic violence and influence access to justice and support. I also want to mention we will be doing a Q&A in the later part of this event. And if you think of any questions that you would like to submit for our panelists to answer, please place them in the chat and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. And now I would like to introduce our first panelist, Danielle Williams. Danielle joined Connect in 2021 as a community educator. In her capacity at Connect Faith, Danielle collaborates with New York City diverse faith community to create and strengthen her response to gender and family violence. She has a passion for empowering diverse faith community to live in their values of social justice and transforming the world. Prior to Connect, Danielle spent many years as an interfaith-based community organizer in California, equipping congregations to enact police accountability, criminal justice reform, violent intervention and prevention, and civic engagement. In her downtime, Danielle enjoyed designing Afrocentric jewelry, watching Nollywood movies, and cooking random recipes from YouTube influencers. She holds a Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of California, Berkeley. Danielle, I'm pleased to introduce you to tonight's discussion. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Paul, for reaching out and inviting me to share today. And I am glad to be here and to shine a light on domestic violence and the way it impacts our communities, especially with the theme tonight. We're talking about intersectionality, which is like jargon, it's jargon, right? But when you think about it, it's the way that these multiple forms of oppression impact our ability to how we live our lives daily, but it impacts our ability to be able to get the supports that we need, especially when it relates to domestic violence. And so, as I was preparing for this presentation today, actually, before, let me tell you a little bit more about Connect. So at Connect, we work to address the underlying attitudes and ideas that contribute to domestic violence in our communities. So we do this through dialogue, we do it through education. I lead the work on faith, but we also have work in our schools. Our director, Q and Marlon, they lead the work dealing with men, and Shireen leads the work dealing with women. So that is the approach that we take, is to get to the root by dealing with the underlying attitudes and ideas that contribute to domestic violence. At Connect, we also recognize the way that these various systems impact survivors. And that is a key part of an analysis of our work, but it's something that we hear as we go about doing our work on the daily basis. And so as I was preparing for this presentation yesterday, I was listening to the Glorilla song. Her new CD came out a couple days ago, and she has a song called He Don't Deserve My Friend, where she is encouraging her friend to leave a domestic violent relationship. And I was doing a lot of reflecting yesterday, because it just really hit me for a pop artist, to sing about this issue. let alone hip hop, let alone an album that's charting #5 on the billboards to help create awareness. And I reflected on my good college friend, Melanie Dunn. We were both transfer students from the same school to UC Berkeley. And we would often talk and complain about our boyfriends at the time, not realizing that we were in toxic and abusive relationships. And unfortunately, Melanie did not graduate with me because her ex-boyfriend killed her, as she made the courageous decision to leave that abusive relationship. And I sat and I thought yesterday about so many women in our community who are impacted. So many of us have lost friends due to domestic violence. So many of us have been impacted ourselves. And yet when we think about the silence in our community is so pervasive. And so that's why I am encouraged by this conversation tonight. I'm encouraged by Glorilla singing about domestic violence on 3 of her songs on a top 5 Billboard CD. I'm also encouraged by, there's many congregations here in New York City at Connect. Like I said, I work with faith communities. There's many congregations here in New York City that are conducting domestic violence awareness services across the city. These are the things that give me hope that we are bringing a light to this issue, and that we're not going to be silent anymore. But I also realize we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do to continue lifting up the shame, supporting survivors, and creating more awareness. So when we talk about intersectionality, I just want to share tonight about, just use the example of Black women survivors. And as I talk about it, so you can see the different ways that different forms of oppression impact Black survivors getting to the safety that they desire. And so whether it is racism, sexism, classism. And before I get to that, I just want to share some stats that Black women do face some of the highest rates of intimate partner violence. Black women are 3 times more likely than white women to experience death as a result of domestic violence. And that domestic violence is the leading cause of death for Black women between the ages of 15 and 35 years old. This is from the CDC. The Institute of Women's Policy Research status of Black women in the United States found that 40% of Black women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. Most African American and African Caribbean women who experience lifetime intimate partner abuse reported physical, psychological, and a combination of psychological, sexual, and physical abuse. You know, oftentimes when we talk about abuse, we often think of the physical abuse, and that is just one tactic of abuse. You know, again, there is the psychological abuse, sexual, physical, financial, also spiritual abuse. And all of these are tactics of abuse that are used to gain power and control. So it's important for us to recognize all of those pieces. Not that one is greater than the other, they all contribute to significant harm. So we all see that as interconnected, and oftentimes survivors are experiencing a mixture of all of those tactics of abuse at the same time. So, you know, when we think about systems of oppression, we think about racism, and that racism does impact how Black women, Black survivors go about getting to their safety in many ways. It impacts it on a systemic level, and then it impacts it on a community level, because the community is responding to that racism, and that impacts how the community shows up for survivors as well. So one of the things that we see is Society and community perceptions, norms, and stereotypes of Black women compound the experience of those experiencing intimate partner violence. And so just a few examples of these. We're talking about, you know, where you go to help, where you're supposed to go to help. Black women face implicit bias dealing with law enforcement. And it's connected to some of these stereotypes as Black women. This is just with everybody, right? Across our society. Black women are seen as aggressive, as a strong. And so at times, it makes it difficult for people to see, due to implicit bias, it makes it difficult for people to see Black women as victims. At times, they may be seen as the aggressors. And then there is also the fear of calling on law enforcement, knowing that a survivor could put either her life or her loved one's life at risk with the prevalence of police brutality. And so that is a concern that takes place. And then, I think in society, we have this idea that survivors, a respectability expectation of survivors. Survivors are supposed to be meek and mild, when the reality is a number of survivors defend themselves, and that is a human right. But too often times, when survivors defend themselves, this respectability comes in, and then there is this lack of empathy. But also, there is a pattern where these survivors become criminalized and incarcerated. We've seen these national examples of Marissa Exalander, who shot a warning shot after her husband beat her, and she was incarcerated. There is Bricia Meadows, who was incarcerated for killing her father, who was relentlessly abusing her and her mother. And too often, survivors like Marissa and Bricia experience dehumanization, criminalization, rather than protection. And keep in mind, in Marissa Alexander's state, there's a law on the books that says stand your ground. But it's apparent that that doesn't apply to Black people, to Black women, and to survivors of domestic violence. And so there's also instances of every system. We're looking at the court systems, for example. I recall working with a survivor who she was grappling with pressure from her faith community, who wanted her to stay with her abusive partner to keep the family together, to keep a Black family together in particular, because our communities are so under attack. We have this desire to keep our families together. And she was in court to receive additional protection around visitation. And it took her a lot to leave that abusive relationship because she was grappling with the guilt of breaking apart a Black family, the guilt of disappointing God and leaving the marriage. And we had talked about this numerous times, and she made that courageous move. And as she was in court to get the additional protection that she needed, the judge berated her and told her that she was essentially a bitter baby mama who was using the system to get back at the baby's father. And that significantly impacted her. And she felt horrible after being publicly berated. And she went back into that abusive relationship as a result. So these biases in the court systems that impact Black women. And we have our systems of help in the community as well. And sometimes even DV organizations can miss the mark. And when we talk about cultural competency and being able to understand the different dynamics of the survivors that are coming in, this is not just race. This can happen on religion as well. This can happen on class. And so, that can get in the way of getting a survivor the help and assistance that they need. And so, so that's the way, that's just a very high level brief explanation of different ways that the systems can impact Black women survivors. So you're seeing racism at play, you're seeing sexism at play. And then when we look back at how does that impact the community, right? Well, those who are Black in here know, whenever we hear that there was a mass shooting on television, we're like, are they Black? Are they Black? Oh, whew, they're not Black. And we have that response because our community is under attack by racism. And they use these stereotypes to justify their attacks against us. So in our mind, we don't want any bad news of any Black person getting out there doing anything bad, because that will be used to further victimize our community. So, you know, the challenge with that is that can contribute, our response to this systemic racism can contribute a silencing that takes place when we're talking about domestic violence. You know, if the person perpetuating the violence is a Black man, and oftentimes in our community, when we're very focused on racism as opposed to sexism, right? Racism is the #1 thing. And then we're also focused on how racism impacts the Black man. And we have to defend our brothers. And so we can shy away from these conversations around domestic violence because we don't want to contribute to the onslaught that we're already facing. So that's just an impact of racism. And so that can contribute to the overall pressure to protect those who may harm us, and the silencing of survivors' pain, not wanting to take a brother down and put a brother into the system. And this is something that is not unique to the Black community. This is something that happens in, actually everything I'm describing happens in all of our communities. When we have our faith trainings, we talk about, when we have our faith trainings, we talk about in our faith communities, there's the temptation to protect your congregation's reputation, the temptation to protect the clergy person. If the clergy person is engaged in domestic violence or harming. So, you know, this is nothing, it's not unique to the Black community, but this is something that is going on that we have to talk about, and one of the challenges that we're dealing with. You know, and so wanting to not reinforce certain stereotypes, like the survivor that I worked with, not wanting to split up a Black family. And so these are the various challenges that survivors are dealing with, let alone you have your systemic challenges, but then you have your community side challenges of the fear, the guilt of putting the person who harmed you through the system, which results in you prioritizing them over yourself. Not wanting to split apart a Black family. Also, you know, in our community, and Connect Faith also found this through a survey 20-something years ago, that for many survivors, the first place that they go to for support is their faith communities, right? But when they go, they often report that their faith leaders are not equipped to support them. And at times, they say things or give guidance that put them back in harm's way. And so, you know, that's another challenge that we are addressing with the Connect Faith work. But this just gives you a very high level synopsis of the experiences of Black survivors, whether it's in the systems and then also in the communities, where at times we struggle with our analysis on sexism and don't always show up for Black survivors. Well, we don't show up for Black survivors the way that we should. And so, you know, what do we do about all of this? What do we do about all of this? So it's a lot we can do, right? You know, obviously there is efforts to increase cultural competency to address implicit bias in the various systems, whether it's law enforcement, with the courts. everyone says they have the trainings on the books that they do, but so everyone says that, but what actually happens in reality is another thing. So continuing the efforts to address that implicit bias. But at Connect, we also recognize that these systems must be changed drastically, And we also recognize the need to equip our communities with the tools and the capacity to be able to support survivors, because we see some of the challenges with these systems. And so it is important for especially if we're trying to meet the unique needs of the diversity of our city and of our nation, right? I'm speaking about Black women today, but there's many, many other groups, many other ethnicities, many other religions, many other, class designations. We have to empower our community-based organizations who know our communities best, who are experts at domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and know how best to serve our communities. And these are the community-based organizations that we should be empowering, that we should be supporting, and that should be funded to be able to carry out the work. I think also at Connect, we are also exploring other ways of accountability, recognizing that sometimes survivors don't want to go through these systems because of the racism and the bias. So, looking at restorative justice, and that is something that is in exploration, being explored, and being done in some cases. And what's beautiful about restorative justice is it gives an opportunity for the survivors to be able to speak their truth, and for community to show up in a way that is supportive. That is also healing, because at times there is not a great deal of support from communities. So restorative justice can bring the community together to stand with the survivor, but also to hold the abuser accountable. And, working with faith communities, we do believe that people can be held accountable and that people can change and behave differently. That's the ultimate goal. So those are just some of the ways that we could, on just a very high level thinking, some of the ways that we can address the intersectionality and try to recognize the different needs of diverse populations and develop the solutions that meet their needs, and to also advocate for systems transformation and for systems change. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Danielle. That was very in-depth. I am grateful for your testimony tonight and for your depth, for your reflection on how we can go about supporting survivors and not become a victim. And I want to say I'm delighted to see you here tonight. I had the opportunity to meet you. I don't know if you remember, but I trained with Connect and you did a very wonderful presentation, and I was deeply touched by your what you had to offer, all of your resources and information, and it was very helpful for me to prepare tonight. And now I would like to introduce our next panelist, who are Tracy West. The Reverend Dr. Tracy West is a scholar, activist, who is a professor of Christian, social, ethnic, and African American Studies at Drew University Theological School in New Jersey. Her teaching research, and activism has focused on gender, racial, and sexual justice, particularly relating to gender violence. In addition to her many published articles, books, chapters, and book chapters, and most recently, she is the author of Solidarity and Defiant Spirituality, African Lessons on Religion, Racism, and Ending Gender Violence. She is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, where she has previously been involved with organizing the Center of the Voices of Queer, Transgender, and People of Color in the struggles for LGBTQIA equality in the church. Dr. West, good evening, and thank you for being here with us tonight in solidarity to bring an end to this epidemic plaguing our communities.
Thank you so much. It is indeed an honor to be here. I want to thank Paul and Bethan and all of the organizers of tonight's event, and also my colleagues who I am serving on this panel. Danielle's presentation was so comprehensive. She left nothing for me to add. So I just want to say a few pieces and then we'll be in conversation. I want to say a little bit about how I got involved in this work and something about intersectionality. And then I have some suggestive ideas about theology. They're just kind of beginning thoughts about the kind of theology we might think about incorporating in Christian faith communities. I very, very slowly came to know that I needed to focus on how we respond to intimate violence. This process happened as I was just starting out many decades ago in the early 1990s, when I served briefly as a local church pastor and a campus minister. I found that I needed intimate violence resources that I just couldn't find. I needed those sources, but I couldn't find them. I needed resources that addressed race, ethnicity, sex, gender, faith, class, those combined dynamics in a primary way in situations of abuse that I was encountering. Anything from a white wife in a heterosexual marriage to her Black husband. The specificity of the abuse issues that occurred in a Black Caribbean family dynamics and a particular ethnic group within a Black Caribbean setting. Or a young white woman at a private college and her fears and shame related to her white family and the kinds of abuse issues that were going on there. To an economically struggling adult Black woman who was a community college student, a woman who was in her 40s and dealing with an abuse situation related to dating, heterosexual dating. The impetus for me as I faced, those are just snapshots, just a few of the situations that I faced. The impetus for me in getting this kind of commitment to that I need to focus on these kinds of issues came out of a sense of inadequacy. I just want to say, I want to emphasize that I didn't know, I knew that I needed resources, I needed help, but I couldn't find those resources. I felt I was doing a poor job as a leader. I knew I was doing a poor job in responding. So as I was sought out for counseling, I was so frustrated at how minimal the intimate violence resources were that centered that combination of race, ethnicity, faith, sex, gender, class, impacts for victim survivors. What I mean is that I kept finding an exclusively individualistic definition, for instance, of domestic violence as first and foremost about power and control within the private relationship of the intimate partners. Now, of course, I'm not saying it's not about power and control, but what I'm saying is all the resources I found said, first, you've got to understand, it's about those power and control dynamics that are between these two people. And at best, there were resources that said there are, of course, related public impacts that are related to race and ethnicity and faith and socioeconomic class. But those only matter as a secondary consideration after one has understood the one-on-one interpersonal dynamics of power and control exerted by the abuser, about, as Danielle pointed out, what you may and may not do related to your finances, what you may and may not do related to your phone and how your phone tracks you and what texts you can send and what texts you received, what friends you may have, what you may wear, when you can leave the home, how you can be in touch with family members. But that kind of private, individual split off from public impacts related to race and gender and class, race and sex gender and socioeconomic class and ethnicity and faith, that split just wasn't the lived reality for any of the victim survivors that I encountered. Publicly constructed social and political messages that shame, objectify, silence, linked to race and ethnicity and faith and class and sex gender, they confer a certain kinds of rights, certain sense of entitlement, a certain sense of who cares what's done to you, not just related to the police and related to the courts and immigration enforcement, but also just related to the rules for welfare benefits, the rules for food stamp benefits, what words are used in the preacher's sermon, in Women's Day, and how that's celebrated at the church, in how the children are prayed over and the youth are prayed over, in the prayers that are lifted up at a wedding that someone is that a faith leader is officiating over. All of those messages and understandings infuse the supposedly private, intimate abuse dynamics of power and control. And not only do they infuse those dynamics, but they infuse our understanding, our ability to recognize those dynamics, to care about them. And it's precisely the erasure of intersectional needs and consequences for victim survivors and the impact of our broader society, our broader culture, our broader communities, our broader faith communities, neighborhood awareness that compelled me to decide, I must learn more. I have to go back to school, which is what I decided to do. I have to teach. I have to write about gender-based violence. I have to do this in order to decrease, perhaps, try to decrease the number of faith leaders who will be as ill-equipped as I was. And also perhaps the number of faith leaders who wait until a crisis occurs and they're facing a crisis before they say that they realize how ill-equipped they are. So then in my setting, I teach in a seminary. I teach an entire course on gender-based violence, focusing in part on domestic violence, specifically intimate partner violence. And I teach a unit of it in my broader classes, broader classes on ethics. And perhaps the most challenging places I also teach, I taught an entire course at the state women's prison in New Jersey on gender violence, perhaps one of the most challenging courses where I learned so much from the student, only perhaps matched by when I teach in the men's prison and I teach a class. We bring students in, by the way, and have students who are both outside students and inside students about issues of faith and race and gender and include violence. And I've also researched and interviewed activists who work on ending gender violence in Ghana, Brazil, and South Africa. Now, I just want to emphasize that my emphasis on intersectionality is on the consequences for victim survivors, but also the consequences for us. Now, I just want to, this is going to seem like I'm a little bit off topic. So just bear with me just for one quick moment. Do you ever, sometimes when I'm reading the news, especially lately, about politics, and I read some really crazy conspiracy theory that millions of people believe, I wonder, I sit there and I go, I mean, I don't get it. How is it possible that so many people believe that ridiculous conspiracy theory that's so obviously wrong? It's so obviously like incredibly nasty, and the biggest number of people often who believe it are Christians, right? People who identify as Christians and are actively Christian. And it's so nasty, and it endorses harm to their neighbors, and often the most vulnerable of neighbors, right? Transgender children or unhoused people who just want to live in tents. They're and I just want to say, it reminds me and it helps me to remember and to understand how there's an intersecting, reinforcing coherence of religious and racial and ethnic and class messages about worth and dignity that make the harm of intimate violence. It's sort of like the conspiracy theory thing. It helps me to remember. It makes the harm of intimate violence seem tolerable, seem deserved, seem inconsequential. When I think about intersectionality, I'm especially interested in how those kind of reinforcing, intersecting messages of shame and blame, they give permission for the violence. They say it's okay, doesn't really matter. We can ignore it. It's not really harmful. So the last piece I want to add here is how we address the violence, especially in faith communities and especially in Christian faith communities, because that is the community I'm a part of. We need to construct anti-violence theology. We need anti-violence theology that addresses suffering, divorce, and sexuality, among many other topics, many others. But I just want to say briefly, we need theology of anti-suffering. We need, within Christian theology, to move from this notion of suffering as good. I often say every single year we glorify suffering around the time of Easter, during Holy Week, over and over and over again. We preach and we speak about the importance of picking up your cross, and to be a true disciple is to suffer and follow Jesus. We need to move away from this understanding of suffering is something good. It earns us grace. It's a marker of real faith. And instead move to an understanding that is anti-suffering, and understand suffering as something that is imposed. And in that crucifixion imposed by the empire, right? By imperial Rome. something that's deliberately imposed, that's extracted, that's disdainfully ignored by political and social and ecclesial church leaders that abuse power and control. We need, besides anti-suffering theology, we need a theology of divorce. The starting point for theology of divorce has to be that for intimate partners, instead of recognizing God as present in what binds you to each other, God is in the man. Instead of seeing God is something that the presence that mandates that you're bound together, God comes together and binds you together, intimate partners. Instead, to see God's Spirit as something that seeds, that births wholeness and flourishing in relatedness, in one's own dignity, in supportive connection to community. A theology of divorce claims divorce as a good ending. Divorce is a good ending. It signals something that is good. It's good to have the cessation, the ending of a covenant between intimate partners because it stops what is extinguishing, what is crushing, what is locking out, what is preventing the flourishing of the divine spirit and communal connection, communal soil that nourishes flourishing. We need a theology of divorce that doesn't just focus on interpersonal breaking of a covenant by a person who abuses their intimate partner. We need to say it is good to focus on the covenant's been broken, and we need to nurture that ending of that relationship where that covenant has been broken because of abuse. But we also need to celebrate how divorce counters social and political messages that cohere and align with the abuser's manipulations, that isolate the victim survivor from divine and communal sparking of flourishing. And finally, we need a theology to address intimate partner violence. We need a theology of sexuality. Just briefly, we need to see God in sexual pleasure of being sensually and erotically touched when the partner wants to be, when there is consent, when there is a direct invitation in an intimate partner relationship. Intimate partner relationship sexuality means vulnerability to another, and abuse is given permission in all the messages of the right to own, to take, to have the partner's body, the partner's sexual self. All the political and social heterosexist messages, for example, of heterosexuals' innate moral superiority, that renders sexual abuse in heterosexual intimate partner relationships as of no consequence. For those of us who are heterosexuals of color, it may seem, for those who are heterosexuals of color, it may seem like a way to combat racist stigma and anti-immigrant stigma is to grab onto heterosexual superiority and to erase the ways in which that ownership of body is included in notions of heterosexuality and our theology of sex. But it's too high a cost to those who are raped and sexually abused in heterosexual intimate partner abuse, and way too high a cost for LGBTQIA lives and dignity sacrificed to the myth of heterosexual superiority. So we need a theology of sex that challenges social histories and stigmas of dominance and ownership, the enforcement of social vulnerability, sort of social vulnerability as something that is a way and a means to exploitation, that give permission for the assault. We celebrate God in the preciousness of sexual pleasure, of consent, of sensual intimacy, of the preciousness of vulnerability. And intersectionality intersectionality, besides allowing us to think about theologies of sex and divorce and anti-suffering, it offers us a radical multivalent tools that we need. We need to prevent the violence fed by an equally multivalent social and political, private and public means to create harm and trauma. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tracy West. It was delightful, the information you provided for us tonight. Considering what we are going through right now, especially leading up to our election, your conversation tonight lend us some clarity to what we might be experiencing, but do not know how to name it. And I think you have, with your presentation, you did just that for so many of us in this webinar tonight. And tonight, our next presenter is Simone Jinger. And I'm delighted to invite her to be our speaker. Simone is an Indo-Caribbean social justice thought leader working to transform her community in New York City. For 20 years, she has supported youth to become cultural and community organizers, has led transformative leadership development program for women and gender expansion people of color to center their healing, and has produced dynamic cultural events to create a platform for bio artists. Simone co-founded the Jahi Sisters in 2007 to build the power of Indo-Caribbean survivors and address the root cause of gender-based violence in her community. She became the organizer's first co-executive director in 2018. At the Jahi Sisters, Simone loved supporting Indo-Caribbean women and gender-expansive people to tap into their inner wisdom, realize their dreams, and embody their life joy and purposes. Prior to her role at the Jahi Sisters, she was the Director of External Communication at the Women's Housing and Economical Development Corporation, which is known as the WHED Co-op, where she raised a total of $1.4 million to institutionalize funding for programs that support the stability of 35,000 women and families in the Bronx. Additionally, Simone is a writer and a performer. She pens and performs spoken word poetry and voices her unique Indo-Caribbean and Boogie Down Bronx experience to commitment to social justice. Tonight, I am pleased to present Simone, our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Eloise. Good evening, everyone. Peace and blessings. My name is Simone Davy Jingor, and I am just feeling so honored to be here tonight. The last two speakers have just really touched me and blown my mind. I've thoroughly enjoyed sitting here and listening to both of you. I'm the co-founder and co-executive director of Jahaji, and I want to thank everyone who was involved in organizing this and for inviting me in. This conversation feels timely, it feels important, and I love that I get to be a part of it with all these other powerful advocates. So I want to kick it off by just sharing that I come to this work as a survivor of domestic violence. And, that is really what drives my passion and my purpose for the work that I do with Jahaji. And, when I think about what Danielle shared about her friend and the fact that they were roommates in undergrad and her friend, she graduated and her friend didn't because her life was taken. It just really touched me in such a deeply personal way because that is the story of what I have seen happen time and time again in my own community. In 2007, there was a young Indo-Caribbean woman who was only 22 years old. She was a new immigrant from Guyana who came to this country looking for a better life. Her family connected her to a family friend, another Indo-Caribbean man who they thought was going to help her, right? She was looking for apartments and he was taking her around, showing her all these different apartments. And just a trigger warning, um, he sexually assaulted her. And because she was undocumented, she never felt like she could actually speak up and report it. But the moment that she was able to, she did. And it's just really unfortunate that this man was released out on bail and went and found her one day. It was the morning time and she was getting ready to leave for work. And he found her as she was leaving for work and he took her life. And that was the first most public incident that I encountered, um, where it made all the mainstream newspapers in New York City, right? It was in the New York Times, it was in the Post, it was in the Daily News. And yet in my own community, all of the community leaders, older men and faith leaders, had nothing to say. It was as though a pin had dropped. It was complete silence. And me and so many other women that I was in community with, we were outraged. We felt just so much um, disgust that no one had anything to say about it. And so we felt like we had to be the leaders. We had to be the leaders in that moment to step up and break that silence and really make sure that Natasha Raymond, the young woman whose life was taken, that her life did not go in vain. And I remember when I was reading that story about Natasha, I was also in an abusive situation. I was a young person who had just come out of college and I found my dream job working with young people at a after school program in Queens. And I also ended up meeting someone and getting into a relationship with them and thinking, falling deeply in love and thinking, wow, like this is the person for me. Until all the red flags and yellow flags started emerging. The person was controlling, would call my job. I would be at work and he would literally call my job multiple times in a row looking for me. My cell phone would be blown up with texts and voice messages, why aren't you picking up your phone? And I think that was like the first sign of like something isn't right here, but I just ignored it. And I just remember that the control, the jealousy, it just continued until it escalated and escalated. And I was really ashamed to even say anything to my own family. My family is 100% supportive of me and has always had my back. But here I was in this really dangerous situation and I felt completely isolated and alone. And that was really the purpose. That is what happens to so many survivors. They are stripped of their power and their agency and left to feel as though they have no one else to turn to but this abusive individual. Um, and I remember I also just felt so ashamed. I felt like it was my fault, right? And that was part of the reason why I couldn't speak about it. I felt as though um, I was the one to cause a lot of this. And it took me many, many years to go on my own healing journey to understand that I was not to blame. It was not my fault. For me to be able to openly speak up and share my story like I am with all of you right now. And, to also connect the dots, because when I heard Natasha's story and I read about it, I thought, you know what? This could actually be me if I don't get out of this situation. And I feel like that was the catalytic moment for me where this light bulb went off in my head. And I'm like, my dignity and my worth means so much more than this toxic relationship that I'm in. And it was the catalyst for how I founded Jahaji, how I came together with several other Indo-Caribbean women who were also survivors. And, we decided to start this movement in our community because for generations, we were taught that, you know, domestic violence, it's okay. It's a normal part of our culture. We need to stay. We stay for our families. We stay because it's the right thing to do. All of those narratives have been passed down to us. We've seen our mothers, we've seen our grandmothers endure this. And I've even had uncles in my own family, when they hear about the work that I do, say, why are you doing work to address domestic violence? That's something that my grandmother went through. That's normal. But I've often had to push back in my own family to say it's not normal. And Jahaji became a healing home for me. It helped me to connect with other survivors and to know that I wasn't alone. And it's become my life's purpose to be able to sit and circle with other survivors, to see them and to affirm them and to let them know that they also are not alone and that they have choice. And so Jahaji, that's how I came to the work. But I also want to just share a little bit about what we do and our mission. So we're an intersectional feminist movement building organization that's committed to achieving gender justice. We were founded in 2007, and we are led by Indo-Caribbean survivors. We activate Indo-Caribbeans in New York to put an end to intimate partner, family, and sexual violence. Our community of support guides women, girls, and gender expansive people to heal and to create lasting change. Through arts activism, leadership development, and grassroots organizing, we amplify survivor voices and visions to transform culture. So I talked a little bit about our founding and why we exist today. We exist because we want to support Indo-Caribbean women to get out of abusive situations. We want to support them to heal and to step into their full power and agency. And we also want to support them through leadership development, become bold feminist change makers who can advocate for change in our community and also with elected officials, right, for larger policy change. We support women to be able to craft their stories into poetry, into testimonies that can be shared at large with our community and in the wider movement, but also when they're sitting in a lobbying visit with the campaign for campaigns and they're in front of an elected official, they can also feel empowered to share their story. Our work is really about shifting culture so that we're dismantling the roots of violence, and telling our people time and time again that this isn't normal, right? That we are here to share that gender-based violence is an issue that we have to uproot and that we have to and dismantle. So I also want to just talk a little bit about intersectionality, because that is the theme tonight. And the way various identities of Indo-Caribbean women intersect, including faith, to make us vulnerable to domestic violence. So as an organization that is working with the historically disenfranchised and marginalized immigrant community in New York City, we sit at the crossroads of many oppressions that we are working to uproot: patriarchy, anti-Blackness, xenophobia, and homophobia. And just to share a little bit about our history, right? After the I don't know how many of you know much about Indo-Caribbean history, but we are one of the largest immigrant groups in New York City, and I feel like people still don't really know who we are. And I'm trying to change that. So I'm going to share a little bit about how we got to the Caribbean and how we got to New York City. So after the abolition of slavery in 1838, there was a new system of slavery that was created, right? Indians were taken from South Asia and brought to the Caribbean to work as indentured laborers. And, they were brought to work on these sugar plantations. And, many of them thought that they were coming for 5-year contracts. That's what they were told, right? That they were going to come to work in the Caribbean, and then after 5 years, they could go back home. But many of them were actually not able to go back home. They were coerced into staying because the British Empire needed a cheap source of labor. What's also pretty important to know is that it was mostly men who were taken to the Caribbean to work as indentured laborers. Women, it was really difficult to get women to come. And so most of the women who were brought were actually kidnapped, right? And it was a ratio of 10 to 1. So for every 10 men, there was one woman who was brought. And this created a huge imbalance. And it also seeded a lot of the gender-based violence that we continue to see here in New York City. So women, because there was such a shortage of women on the plantations, and the goal was to ensure that Indians could stay and continue to be this cheap source of labor. They were encouraged to partner up and to have families. And because there was such a shortage of women, like there would be men that would actually be fighting. There was so much harm that was caused. The women's, sorry, trigger warning again, but women's noses were chopped off, their hands were chopped off. There were things done to mutilate their bodies to make them less desirable so that other men couldn't steal them. There was fits, their lives were taken in fits of jealous rage. And when you read about reports from that time, there were like so many women whose lives were being lost, and until like finally like attention was brought to it. And I don't think that was until like the very end of indentureship, when it ended in 1917. But that same kind of generational trauma and that same kind of violence that has shaped us as a people is what has been brought to New York City. Oftentimes, the tool that was used to take a woman's life was a cutlass, which was a tool that you would use to chop sugarcane. And in New York City, we've had women whose lives were taken. And when you hear about how their life was taken, for example, Rajwanti Baldeo was a 46-year-old woman whose life was taken, in a very public manner on the street in Richmond Hill, Queens, where she's lived her whole life. And the abuser actually used a cutlass, the same machete that was used back home, to take her life. So when we do this work in New York City, we're really trying to address this generational harm and help women to heal and to understand that, we have power and we have agency. We do not have to stay in these situations. And the other thing that is really hard, is that we're women and girls and gender expansive people who hold many intersecting identities, right? That continue to make us vulnerable. We're working class, we're queer, we're new immigrants to this country. We're also first generation Americans, meaning we're the first in our families to have been born and raised in the US. We're young people, we're multi-faith, we're Hindus, we're Muslims, we're Christians, and we're also survivors. And to give an example of how these intersecting identities make us vulnerable, I'll hone in on what it means to be an Indo-Caribbean working class and immigrant survivor dealing with economic insecurity. From our experience of doing this work in our community, we have witnessed that many women have to flee domestic violence back home in the Caribbean, in Guyana, and in Trinidad, and their only path to safety is coming to New York City. And most of them are vulnerable because they have only been here in New York City for maybe 2 years, and at most for 5 years, without any support systems. All of their families are still back home in the Caribbean. And just because you've gotten out of one abusive situation doesn't mean you won't find yourself in another one, especially when you're living with this trauma in your body and you may not have started your healing journey. So we will see that an Indo-Caribbean sister who has fled abuse back home sometimes will end up getting into another situation because of how vulnerable you can be when you're all alone in a new city and you're seeking partnership and love, right? We've also seen firsthand that many survivors depend on their abusers for food, shelter, and to support their children. Immigration status can add additional vulnerability, as survivors may be unable to work legally and are often threatened with deportation by their abusers. Indeed, the majority of murders in our New York community as a result of domestic violence were against young immigrant women new to the country and struggling economically. So I mentioned Natasha Raymond and I mentioned Rajwanti Baldeo. I also want to lift up Donna Rahana Doyjoy, who was only 27 years old when her life was taken by her partner. And, she came here and, was working at a local restaurant and bar when she met her husband. And, because she was trying to leave the marriage, he found her and he took her life. And I feel like there's like this pattern and this trend that we continue to see time and time again. And as organizers and advocates, we're constantly holding our breath, hoping that we're not going to wake up to hear about another young woman whose life was taken in our community. And I just want to pivot and talk a little bit about the role of faith. So faith has been a force in helping many of us who identify as survivors to stay resilient, right? And I don't think I feel like that's probably across the board in any community. But we attend our Hindu mandirs, we attend our mosques and our churches to find solace and peace and to overcome our personal struggles and challenges. It can be a healing balm, yet it has also played a problematic role in its lack of support for survivors. Most of the women and girls that we work with, that we've connected with through faith institutions, they often tell us time and time again that when they come forward to share with their faith leader that they're in an abusive situation, to seek counsel and to seek support, they're encouraged to stay in that situation and make it work. I'm sorry, y'all. Just give me 1 second. I'm sorry, everyone. Just full transparency that I am a mom of a 4-month-old who is bawling. And I just had to, my mom is supporting me right now with childcare. So I just had to just ask her to hold it down since I'm in the middle of speaking with you all. So apologies for having to turn my camera off. So I will try to get back my thoughts of where I was at. Yes, I was talking about faith and its role and how survivors aren't often able to get the support that they need. I'll pivot again to just talk about some of the ways that we're addressing gender-based violence and working with faith leaders. One of the things that we've noticed is that the reason faith leaders might be sharing with survivors that they need to stay and go back into these situations is because they haven't been trained and educated to understand that there's actually other alternatives. So in 2022, we started doing trainings with faith leaders in our communities who were coming from the mandirs, who were pundits, who were pastors, and who were imams, right? To help them to understand that, there's signs that you can notice when a survivor comes to you and is sharing that they're in an abusive situation. There's things that you can do to support. We started training them to understand, okay, so how do you recognize the signs of abuse? What are some of the things that you can actually say? What are the resources that you can actually share with the survivor so that they're connected to what they need? And then also there's community organizations that you can refer them to, so building that relationship and training these faith leaders up also created a pathway for how they could send many of their constituents to us at Jahaji so that we can provide the direct services, right? We're the only Indo-Caribbean organization in New York City and frankly in the US that's doing this work. And, there's a cultural competency that we bring that others may not have to understand how we actually meet a survivor who's Indo-Caribbean where they're at. And so helping faith leaders in our community to understand that they don't have to be the only support for the survivor, they can send them to Jahaji where we can provide them with safety planning and we can connect them to other agencies across the city to find immigration support, to find legal support. So that's one way that we've been trying to come up with a solution and a strategy. The other thing that we started doing is bystander intervention trainings. Our work is really with Indo-Caribbean women and girls, but we've been asked time and time again also, why don't you work with men? And for a long time, our answer was, we don't think that's our work. But I think we're leaning more into what that could look like. And so we're starting to do these bystander intervention trainings because The most recent murder that we had in our community was a young woman by the name of Diana Ramjag, um, you know, who was actually arguing, in a heated argument with her partner for many, many hours in front of a local business, a bodega. Um, and there were so many people who were walking by who noticed, but didn't say anything, didn't intervene. And, he ended up taking her life right in front of that business on the street that her house was on, that her children, in the house that her children lived in, and her family was actually home when it happened. Um, but the bystander intervention training is really helping people to understand that if you see something like this happening, the other sad thing to mention is that people were pulling out their cameras and recording it, you know? So, like, we want to train folks in these bystander intervention trainings to understand that they're tools, they're skills that we can develop to de-escalate situations when we see them happening, to intervene in a really safe way. Because we also have to think about our own safety. But if we see something happening, we don't just walk by and let it go. We figure out how we can intervene in a way to make sure that person is okay. And I think that moment and that situation with Diana Ramjag was really jarring, and it really catapulted us to also think about, well, how do we address that? And these trainings are going to include men and also local businesses, because the other thing that we're seeing is that a lot of the times, women are being sexually harassed, and they're working in these local bars and restaurants, and these business owners who are hiring them also don't know how to intervene when they see things happening in their own restaurant and bar. So, like, we're also including men and business owners in these bystander intervention trainings. I will stop there because I feel like I could talk and talk about the work that we do at Jahaji all day, but I'm here to answer any questions that folks have. And I really want to think about how we're sharing resources and learning from each other, because what we're doing in the Indo-Caribbean community, I'm sure, is also work that is happening in other communities of color. And we're here to learn and to listen also.
Thank you so much, Simone. This was very informative, and congratulations on the birth of your baby. Thank you for being here. I know you took this opportunity to come and share your knowledge and information with us, and it is so deeply appreciated. Coming from the Caribbean myself, I totally understand the work that you're involved in, and it is so needed because so many of our Caribbean brothers and sisters are afraid to speak on domestic violence and are ashamed by not being able to access resources in this new land. So it is very important, your work, and I'm grateful that you're here tonight. I would like to let the audience know that if you have any questions, you can put in the chat. I already see that there are several questions. And so the next 15 minutes, I will open up the questions for the panelists. Right now, we have a question, and any of the panelists can answer this. What, if any, is the difference between the skills needed for crisis intervention and those needed for developing prevention strategies? And what steps can be taken to create more awareness about intersectionality in the community and in the service system? Any of the panelists can answer this. Shall I repeat the question? Yes, so what if any in the difference between the skills needed for crisis intervention and those needed for developing preventive strategies? And what steps can be taken to create any awareness about intersectionality in the community and in the service system? Dr. West, would you like to take that question?
I think the first thing I want to do is just take a breath, because I just feel moved, and also the weight of the witness of my colleagues to the harm and the death and literally the murder, the most extreme form of gender-based violence, femicide. So just to kind of those the weight of those tragedies, and to just feel that, because it's very painful. So I think that's the first thing I guess I want to say in my feeling. And so thank you for that witness. Even though it is painful, it also helps us to understand the stakes that we're talking about here. So I think I want to combine my response to some of the questions also that were in the chat, and to just stress the ways in which the prevention work often gets backburnered to the crisis work. And that then keeps us in a cycle of being reactive. And there has to be, and also keeps the crisis responses inadequate. And so it related to, and so those of you who are service providers can answer much more the service piece better than I can. But I just wanted to say, and the gift of intersectionality is that in any kind of training, not that the importance of if a faith leader sits down with an active, abusive couple, where the abuse is going on, that faith leader is literally endangering the life of the person who's being abused. But often the faith leader is so tuned into pleasing, particularly if it's a cisgender heterosexual couple, pleasing the man and honoring him and listening to him and trusting him. So if you don't start with thinking, I gotta figure out what's happening in terms of gender and my response, you don't start there, then in fact, the crisis gets perpetuated. I'm going to stop and let my colleagues speak.
Yeah, I just want to second what Dr. West shared. You know, in community organizing, we say the first revolution is internal. And so, you know, part of the Connect Faith work is in terms of prevention, it's creating a space for faith leaders to actually dive into their theology, into their beliefs, into their ideas together, both within their own specific tradition. Because, you know, like, you know, what I said earlier, everyone doesn't like to share their dirty laundry. Okay, so then we'll just do you within your group. Okay, what are your teachings on divorce? What are your teachings on submission? What are your teachings on roles and gender? And, you know, we dissect that, and then we look at, okay, how does that actually impact survivors in reality? Because if it's harmful, and sure, this is what people believe, you have to have space to critically reflect on it. We're not in the business of telling people what to believe, but we do create that space for that critical reflection of theology, of traditions, of beliefs, and how it impacts survivors, both in a way that contributes to harm, but also how does it empower survivors? How does it unapologetically say that we are not for domestic violence, that we are for lifting up the lives of women? So, you know, Dr. West, what you were saying about that anti-violence theology, that anti-suffering theology, I would love to work with you and clergy on that. Because, you know, that's a really important piece, because you can teach folks the steps to do, what to do when someone discloses. But if they still have these harmful ideas and mindsets, they can still put survivors at harm. So I think like that's the work that has to be done, that twofold of as what all my colleagues are saying, getting to the root of the matter. And then getting folks to organizations like Jahaji who can develop that safety plan, who can get them the services they need. Clergy don't need to be doing everything. That's what our community-based organizations are for.
Yeah, thank you. Oof. I just realized that I also just needed to take a moment to take a breath. So I'm gonna invite y'all in with me.
Well, yet your presentation was very powerful, and it take us back to naming what abuse really is. And once we name it, I think we can address it, abuse and intimate violence.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that, and you know, I love what you're all talking about in terms of like theology. And I think for us in our community, we've also, as part of the way that we're working with faith leaders, also helping them. Like, I know there's stories that are like, there's empowering stories that lift up, you know, like feminists, like just like there's feminist icons in Hinduism. There's like, um, there's so many like empowering stories that can be shared, but it never is. Like we just don't hear them. And I feel like we as women and girls and queer folks have to go and like find those stories on our own and dig into those books on our own because the faith leaders just don't end up sharing them, you know? And I feel like there's actually been like a movement in our community of younger faith leaders, of female faith leaders, of like LGBTQ faith leaders who are actually like creating those inclusive spaces and are sharing more of the liberatory stories from like our like Ramayan, or like about the Davies, you know, like these warriors, you know, the things that we can actually like look up to and understand and embody. Because like time and time again, when you're told one narrative and that's what you know, that's what we're taught to believe. And I feel like those are the things that perpetuate the violence and the harm also, right? And it upholds the patriarchy. So like if we can actually hear more of these empowering liberatory stories, it will actually be part of the culture shift that we need to see. So I'm all for it.
Yes, I just want to co-sign that as well. You know, pull out the resources that can help us, and then also to look at our cultures. So, we were working with a Nigerian pastor who said, "Okay, we have some stories in Christianity." He says, "But look at our culture. We have Oshun, we have Yemenya, we have so much resources from our culture that we can empower from." And then a diversity of masculinities in African spirituality that could be used to teach men how to be in better relationship with women. So I want to co-sign us looking at all of our faith, spiritual, and our cultural resources.
Yes.
One of the questions in the queue is, how do you address insecurities, especially when the case is in court and the perpetrator is still out on bail? Can someone answer that question?
Sorry, can you repeat it? Just trying to make sure I
Yes.
understand.
The question was, how do you address insecurity, especially when the case is in the court system, and the perpetrator is out on bail? So the person wants to address their confidence and insecurities of dealing with domestic violence.
I mean, I feel like at Jahaji we hold like an abolition framework. We don't feel like the criminal justice system works, especially in terms of protecting survivors. You know, it's not the way that survivors can actually find like accountability for the harm that's been caused. And like, how do we look at different cultures and practices that are more restorative? that don't necessarily have to involve the carceral system. Because I talked about Natasha Raymond, who, you know, she ends up reporting it. The person was released on bail. He came out and he found her. He took her life. It's like there's something about this system and the way it's set up that's not going to help us. So, like, how do we think outside of the box and actually explore more creative accountability mechanisms, you know, that are community driven, that don't involve law enforcement? Because I don't feel like that's the answer. That may not address the question directly, but I think it speaks to this tension that I feel in this work.
Definitely. And I think, and to that point, one of the ways is to work with community organizations on the ground for a safety plan, to help a survivor to think through their day-to-day activities, and basically, yeah, to come up with a plan to maximize their safety to the fullest extent, because the system often fails to protect survivors.
Thank you very much for that reflection. I have a question here for Tracy. So over the years of your work of teaching Christian faith leadership, what changes have you seen in their concern about addressing domestic and intimate partners' violence in the communities they serve?
Well, I know we're nearing our end of time here, so I just want to join this question with the previous question, and just to really emphasize how much I'm in agreement with the need to have this kind of direct response to an ongoing dangerous situation, related to safety planning, and also a much like restorative justice, to me is not a crisis moment response. To me, that it's a long-term kind of response. But I just wanted to emphasize the ways in which I see possibilities, more possibilities than I used to, of a range of leaders, not necessarily clergy and pastors, but more a range of leaders who are part of communities that are related to faith communities, have leadership in faith communities, nonprofits. So I just see a broader range of leaders emerging to create what I would kind of call resistance networks. So not just organizations, but a little bit more sort of movement work. And so I'm just grateful for that. Very, very grateful for that. And related to safety planning is also, that's a really intersectional issue, because safety planning doesn't work if you're betrayed by your community and by your family members. And so what do you put in place so that people are ready to participate and support a safety plan?
Thank you very much. I know we are over the time, but I saw another question in the chat dealing with music, and it dealt with let me see if I can pull it up. It dealt with the rap culture, and I would like to read it out. Let me see. But it asks about the influence of rap culture and what can we do. I don't know if you can see the question in the chat, but I know that Danielle spoke about music and how it influenced her piece, and it would be really good if you can speak on the influence of music and how it interlocks with domestic violence and sexual assault.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. The way I look at it is this is pervasive in every aspect of our culture. If you're not getting it from hip hop, you're going to get it from your faith community. If you're not getting it from your faith community, you're going to get it from TV. If you're not getting it from TV, you're going to get it from the politicians that run this nation. So with that said, is it in hip hop? Yes, it is. And that is something that we are connected to, that we've been grappling with for many, many years, right? At the same time, even the church kids still get these same messages that is in the hip hop. And so I would encourage us not to pinpoint one facet or genre through which this patriarchy, dehumanization of women flows through, but to see how it's pervasive in our many, 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 many spaces. As we are tackling that issue. I am a fan of hip hop, been a fan of hip hop for years, and since I've been in college, we've been having these conversations for a long time, as we've been having these conversations in our faith communities and throughout the various facets of society. But yes, all music, rock music, country music. And if we actually analyze some gospel songs, there is themes around obedience and submission that can also be problematic too. So it's definitely, it is in hip hop, and it plays a role, and it's in the rap music as well, and everywhere.
Yeah, I was gonna say that in Indo-Caribbean culture, we have this genre called chutney, and it really reveres like just drinking rum. You'll have so many songs about drinking rum, and and like the way that, and like there, and in our culture, like there's like this attitude that there's alcoholism connected to like suicidal, like this guy and has like one of the largest suicide rates in the world, which is crazy to me. And a lot of it is oftentimes driven by the alcoholism, which is like a form of like just numbing out trauma. We've seen that as part of like the way folks have dealt with it stems back to like the days that we were in indentured laborers also. And what I was thinking is that like when we hear these like more like contemporary like songs that's still lifting up that message, I feel like it's just so toxic. Like it's also lifting up like this toxic like masculinity. And I think one of the ways that we push back when we talk about culture shift work too is like how do we see more like empower, like it's the same thing, like how do we see more empowering messages coming through in the music that people that still brings that feeling of joy and like aliveness.
Yeah, I would add also that there's opportunity for creativity. That part of the pushback. What is exciting about music, all genres of music and arts more generally, is the ways in which it shifts imagination about what is possible, about what kinds of relationships are possible, about how I love this sort of how expansively we are gendered, and how we can have caring connection within all of the ways in which we see ourselves as expansively created and understood. And the arts and music can be a place where a range of groups from lots of different cultural backgrounds, you can create rituals with messages that just blow away um, the constraints that reinforce domination and harm and trauma and violence and the right to violate. There's also the possibility for creative ways of relatedness and flourishing and consent and all of those things that arts allow.
Thank you so much. It's a shame that time has always play a limit into what we can speak about, but a conversation such as this, time is not enough. I think it's such an important conversation to have, and every the information that you provide tonight was just so poignant and reassuring. And for me personally, I have a sense of relief in a way because of what we are experiencing in our in what's going on right now in our society, especially with the election. There's so much uncertainties, but so what's going on with what it helped us understand is we can name abuse for what it is, and we can prevent the onslaught of domestic violence and intimate violence by naming it. And so I felt a sense of ease. I would love to thank each and every one of our panelists. Dr. Tracy West, thank you for your indelible words of wisdom and your work that you have done in teaching and enlightening the faith community. Simone, thank you again for being here. You came on with very little notice time, and with a young baby, I really appreciate you being here tonight. And of course, I'm delighted to thank Daniel Williams, who with Connect Faith, I think your program is absolutely delightful, and I learned so much. I wish everyone will connect with your program and have some training, because everyone knows someone who is impacted by domestic violence. At this time, if Paul is available, I would like for him to come on and give us and say a few words before we close out tonight, and thank all of the attendees.
I want to echo Eloise's word. Thanks to all of you for the wisdom you've shared, for the depth of this conversation. To me, this was a phenomenal thing that hopefully we can pass on to so many more people. We have recorded this, and we will send a copy of a link to the recording to everybody who is signed up for this webinar, so we can pass this on. I see what we're doing as following what Jesus talked about in sowing seeds. We're in the process of seed sowing, of naming the issue, of naming the problems, of beginning to search and struggle for solutions. And that is such an important thing to do. And in some ways, in whatever our faith may be, we do this with the hope and the sense of faith that the seeds will bear fruit, and that we will see the changes that are necessary to uplift the women who have been so oppressed within our society. Just as a shout out as well is, Eloise, this was her first experience as a moderator, and I applaud her for the job that she did. And I applaud all that was done by the folks in the background, Beth Ann and her team. And want to give a shout out for December the 5th, which is our next webinar, which is going to be on, again, part 3 of Breaking the Silence, Changing the Culture of Rape and Sexual Assault, a conversation that will be happening during the 13 days of gender justice. And you all who have signed up for this will be getting an invitation to that next event, and we hope that you will join us for that as well. And that when you get the link to be able to review and reabsorb the things that were shared, the wisdom that was shared, the depth of what was shared with us tonight, that you will consider that again and pass that on so that we can sow seeds in a broader way. I worked in the field for 34 years. October is full of events. And it's difficult at times to make all of the events. And there are people I know who wanted to be here tonight where there were just too many events happening at the same time. And it is our hope that by recording this and by spreading the word of what was shared tonight, that we can replicate and we can expand the seed sowing that's happened right here and right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the panelists. And I want to especially thank all the members on our task force. I just want to say this as an opportunity that I'm glad to have been able to participate in. Together, we can break the silence. Let's help survivors reclaim their voices. Good night.
Amen. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Good night,
Good
all.
night, everybody.